Hello and welcome to the Jewish Heretics Podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order and the Morris Winchevsky Center. We are a secular, progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name is David Wall, and I am the community's cultural programmer, and I'll be your host today. For this, the 9th episode of our podcast, I had the great honor of speaking to internationally celebrated singer, songwriter, actor, and Yiddishist, Daniel Kahn. He was born and raised in suburban Michigan in a Reform Jewish home and became excited by acting at a young age. He went to college for theater arts and quickly began to combine his acting and playwriting with his developing left politics, drawing on the theatrical legacy of Bertolt Brecht. After graduating, Daniel spent time in New Orleans working as a labor organizer. It was there that he was first introduced in a serious way to Klezmer music and the Yiddish revival. And after a trip to Klez, Canada, an annual Klez Fest in Quebec, he became hooked, as it were. Daniel began spending time in Europe, especially Germany, where he met, studied with, and ultimately collaborated with luminaries such as Alan Byrne and Michael Alpert of Brave Old World, one of the premier ensembles of the so-called Klezmer revival. He also formed relationships with machers in the New York Jewish cultural scene, especially the late, great Adrienne Cooper, one of his biggest influences and musical heroes. For decades now, he has performed and recorded with his band The Painted Bird and as a much-revered solo artist. One of Daniel's special talents is translating with collaborative help and soulfully singing Yiddish translations of English songs, including Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land, and many others. He's also gone the other way, creating for many the new standard English versions of classic Yiddish songs. In 2023, Daniel was presented with the prestigious Dreaming in Yiddish Prize, created in Adrienne Cooper's name, celebrating artists who have significantly contributed to the blossoming of new Yiddish culture. Here's our conversation. Daniel Kahn, thanks so much for taking time out to be on our podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. It's a pleasure to be here. Shalom Aleichem.
Alechem Sholem. So you are in Hamburg on a houseboat.
Yes. I'm a hamburger on a houseboat. That's right.
We'll get into your life in Germany. That'll be part of the interview. But for now, let's jump right in. If there is a conceit, a focus to this podcast, it's how people express their individual Jewishness. So I'd like to ask, how did you get your Jewish superpowers? You grew up in Detroit. Tell me about your parents, how you were raised. Did you grow up, for example, in a religious environment?
Yes. The Germans have this great word, which is Jein, which contains both yes and no, like ja and nein. So yeah, the answer to your question is Jein. I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit. I went to a Reform temple that was large enough to, if it were a colony on Mars, then we would be able to populate or colonize the entire planet. It was a huge complex, sort of nestled amongst golf courses and subdivisions. And I think that they have a membership in the thousands of families. They have half a dozen rabbis, and it's like a Jewish megachurch.
I was going to say that. It sounds like those big churches you see in suburban America. That's interesting.
And I think that it's not unrelated to those. And I grew up in that temple, and I went through their educational system. I was bar mitzvahed there. It gave me a lot to fight against. I think I'm still kind of grappling with the kind of cognitive dissonance that I was raised in, as a suburbanite, white, assimilated American kid in Detroit, which is an environment of extreme economic stratification, extreme ethnic and racial segregation in some regards. the suburban model of ethnic enclaves. And I grew up around a lot of virulent racism, not within my family necessarily. My family, they were good liberals. And their attitude towards the religion was also liberal, in that particular kind of American lifestyle way of treating religion. We did the holidays. We didn't keep kosher. We
Hmm.
were culturally Jewish, whatever that means. My father was a pretty much an atheist.
Right.
Um, and but middle class. My mother was a public school teacher for decades, kindergarten. Uh, you know, union
Can
member. My father was a small businessman. You know, and
can I ask what the relationship in the home was to Israel and Zionism?
well, the name Israel is in the name of the synagogue that I went to. I mean, I think it's split off from the other major Reform shul because the other shul wasn't Zionist enough in the 40s. So Zionism was part and parcel of the Judaism which was bequeathed to me. You pray in front of a bima that has an American and an Israeli flag on
Right. Right.
it.
Okay. Okay.
I wasn't so questioning about that when I was a small child, but I don't know, it didn't take long for me to start questioning some of those orthodoxies. It's interesting. We don't, for such a supposedly non-orthodox approach to Jewishness and to Judaism, there was a kind of implied orthodoxy when it came to the topics of Israel and as well as the topic of Jewish history, that there was a kind of scorched earth attitude towards Jewish history, like we don't move backwards. Europe is scorched earth. In some ways, having moved out of the city of Detroit into the suburbs was another kind of scorched earth approach. There's a friend of mine in Montreal who wrote a song in Yiddish about that, about how we don't "Naret nicht von der alter Heim, nicht von Poland, nicht von Detroit," you know, places we don't go back to. And so, and in that regard, Detroit was the first previous homeland that I embraced because I rejected the suburbs and I moved into the city and I lived there and I found my community in Detroit and then before moving elsewhere.
So, in terms of your progressive politics, was it a sudden thing or did you come to it gradually? By way of example, my own mother, may her memory be a blessing, told me my whole life that she had kind of discovered radical politics as a young teenager when she lived through the Rosenberg trials.
Mhm.
Was there anything like that for you, or did you gradually come into what I would call your radical politics?
I think it was more gradual. I mean, I can speak about the environment in which I was more radicalized, which was, first of all, what I just said, like kind of immersing myself in the countercultural scenes in Detroit in the 1990s
Mm.
with my friends, like getting into the punk rock scene, getting to know politically engaged folks there. Like Detroit had at the time, and probably still does, a very, very deep radical um history, of radical union organizing. And I mean, I knew folks, they would have like anarchist versus Marxist softball
Oh,
games,
amazing.
you
It's
know,
amazing.
and I knew, and in the music scene and like the radical arts scene and the theater scene, which was my scene, um, there was just a long tradition of yeah, everything from anarchism to Maoism to you know, Trotskyites and et cetera. And so that was the world that I became a young adult in. I used to go and hang out at the world headquarters of the Industrial Workers of the World. The Wobblies had their headquarters in Ypsilanti, Michigan. So I would go there and I would read about the history of the IWW and I would learn those old Joe Hill songs and I that was my scene when I became a,
So how old are
a
you? How
semi-independent.
old are you when?
Around that, we're talking about 16,
Wow.
17, 18 years old. So even before college, then, I went to the University of Michigan and yeah, it was a pretty like steady march to the left for me. I mean, by the time I was studying, I was getting more and more into political theater. I was doing theater workshops in prisons and juvenile detention centers. I was reading in the theater. I was reading a lot of Brecht, a lot of Auguste Boal, things like that. And I was writing poetry. I wasn't really writing music yet. I was playing a lot of music, but not writing my own songs. Yeah.
We'll get there. We'll get to the songs. Before that, there's a kind of gap in your bio when I read it that sticks out to me.
Yeah.
You went to college for theater, but somehow you ended up in New Orleans
Mhm.
working as a labor organizer for a nursing union. What was the bridge that got you there? How did you end up in New
Oh,
Orleans?
well, okay. Hmm. Let me think. What's the So I had a lot of friends from Detroit ended up moving down to New
And
Orleans.
why?
And well, because New Orleans is, at least at the time, felt like a warmer,
Well, yeah.
more relaxed version of Detroit. Like there was a kind of wonderful anarchic spirit down there, and it was cheap.
When are you talking about? Is this the?
This is late 90s, 2000, 2001. I moved to New Orleans in 2001 at the end of the year,
Mhm.
but I had been going there for several years, several times a year to visit friends.
Mhm.
We used to make that drive without a stop,
Wow.
Detroit or Ann Arbor to New Orleans. And it was there that I fell in love with klezmer music. It was there that I sort of cut my teeth as a singer-songwriter.
Mm.
And yeah, there were several waves of different groups of friends of mine from Detroit, from northern Michigan, um, who moved to New Orleans or lived there part-time. When I decided pretty much I graduated from the university in 2001, and the the morning after I graduated from a 4-year program where I had a degree then in theater studies, I decided to sort of not pursue that. I decided to not move to New York or become a professional actor or anything. I decided to be a songwriter. I was hanging out with all these folk musicians in northern Michigan and in Detroit, and then when I went down to New Orleans, they were there, and I just started writing songs nonstop. And I still did theater. I produced and directed some theater down there as a response to the no, at that time to the Afghanistan war.
Mhm.
I got jobs in New Orleans in addition to, gigging as a musician. And for a long time, I was working for Acorn,
Right.
which which was a community organizing nonprofit, I guess. But through them, I got some organizing jobs for the SEIU, the Service Employees International
Right.
Union. And believe me, organizing a union in Southern Louisiana it's not even uphill. It's like it's a mountain climbing.
Right. Right.
It's a kind of it's an alpine task.
Right. Did you
Um,
learn any what they call transferable skills in the biz? Did any of what you learned trying to climb that mountain, as it were, did you retain that? Was it useful later in life?
it taught me some important lessons about like sort of the nuts and bolts of on the ground
Mm.
politics, of community politics. There were a number of campaigns that we were involved in, which sort of what had temporary wins and then ultimate losses. On the state level in Louisiana, we were pushing for a wage measure, a minimum wage measure in New Orleans, and it taught me to kind of regulate my expectations. Um, you got to lose a lot. You got to lose a lot of battles.
Mm.
I became maybe a little bit less idealistic.
Hmm.
I think I developed more of a resilience model of progressive. I basically see it as like the world is not already worse than it is directly because of the people who didn't allow it to get worse.
Right.
And in many ways, we have, of course, made progress. There's no period in history that I would want to teleport back to. I'm not saying that that makes me like a an optimist. I'm just aware that, everything that we have was fought for.
What was your gateway to Yiddish? How did you end up in the universe of the Yiddish language?
It kind of just it sort of kidnapped me. Like, I don't know. I got, like I said, I first heard klezmer music on the streets and in the bars of New Orleans, and there were a couple of key friends of mine, David Simmons, an accordionist who used to live in Vermont. Now he lives down in New Orleans. I met him in New Orleans, and he turned me onto a lot of stuff. My friend Michael Tuttle, uh, with whom I played in the Painted Bird for over a decade. Um, my good friend Patrick Farrell, the wonderful accordionist, pianist, composer, who now lives in Berlin. One of my best friends. Um, th- like Patrick and David Simmons told me to go to Klez Canada, and the first time I went there was in 2004, and that was kind of the road to Damascus moment, to use a totally to use a goyish metaphor there. I'll say that was my come to Jesus moment, was to yeah. Uh and yeah, so that was 2004. I had already been playing klezmer sort of on my own. Uh what I, what I- what records I could find, what CDs or books, and I hung out with a band called Yiddishist for a while. They're from Madison, Wisconsin, and they still win best klezmer band name. I think that's I have yet to find a better one.
So klezmer is one thing, but to me, being fully ensconced in the Yiddish language is a whole other level. You know what I'm saying? So how did that happen?
It it didn't occur to me at first. To be honest, at first I was really just interested in the instrumental music, and I was an English language songwriter, and at the time I was pretty monolingual. I studied some French, but I wasn't working with any of the languages. I wrote a short play in French once, but I I it never would have occurred to me to write in um another language, or to, I although on my very first album I recorded an English language version of Dona Dona, and I sang a little bit of the Yiddish because I really liked the song, and I heard it first in English in translation. And I had been working at a Jewish theater where there was sort of some Yiddish kite in the background, but it was a very loosely Jewish regional theater. And once I got into klezmer and went to Klez Canada, that was when I first heard Adrienne Cooper. That was when I first heard Michael Alpert. That was when I first heard Lawrence Sklamberg, who I didn't meet him personally then. I met him later. But really it was, yeah, hearing Michael and Adrian, I realized
Right.
there was something deeply radical about performing in Yiddish in the 21st century, the way that they did, as progressive,
Right.
um, radical
Mhm.
artists. Um,
So you mentioned that you studied French, you wrote a short play in French, but is Yiddish different? Is there something intrinsically different about the Yiddish language when compared to other languages? Does it have specific ingredients? And how is that manifested?
well, no, I think clearly, yes. I'd like to say that, well, I'll push back against that first and say, like, Yiddish is a language, and it can be used to express
Mhm.
anything that one wants. And there's no lack of, you know, Yiddish having the flavor of all kinds of things that don't interest me at all, or that I don't want to support. Like it's I'm not saying that it's inherently progressive. But it
Mhm.
does jive with a lot of interests that I already had. I was already interested
Mhm.
in songs of social, um, you know, social meaning, songs that dealt with um, issues of economics and justice and poverty and oppression, war, migration, displacement, but also it's uh, great songs that have to do with food and drinking and merriment and death, and it's a language which carries whole worlds with it, and there are worlds which I didn't really know. I wasn't really told about the fabric of the worlds which my people came from. Um,
Well, instinctively, I understand what you're saying. It almost seems like you're saying that Yiddish is infused with something, with, say, social justice. But how do we articulate that? What is specifically Yiddishkeit? What is the essence of Yiddishkeit in this context?
Not necessarily. No, I mean, there's just as much retrograde, chauvinistic, you know, tr- you know, totally conservative traditions, which are associated with and concerned with Yiddishkeit.
But
Um,
what is it about Yiddish specifically that's such an excellent conduit for radical politics? What is it? Maybe it's impossible to define it.
well, there was a kind of epochal shift, I think, with the modern era, and there were several generations, one after the other, who, within the Yiddish speaking context, in
Mhm.
the Yiddish idiom, they were rejecting centuries of um, tradition, and that was in some ways the enactment of and that was itself a tradition. There were traditions of subversion and traditions of
Yes.
subverting traditions, and Roskies calls it creative betrayal. um and it's something which I still see in so many ways. Like, I know so many people who have moved to the other side of the world. They move it's I think it's become less and less a particularly Jewish characteristic. Maybe the world is becoming more Jewish in that regard, but I think that was not unheard of at all, that each generation radically changes their cultural orientation, their religious affiliation, their national association, the continent. It's like generations and generations after Jews, where each generation they're going to the other
Mhm.
side of the world. Whether it's the old joke, I'm moving to Australia. The two Jews, he says, "Yeah, I'm moving to Australia." He says, "Oh, that's so far away." He says, "Far from what?" This kind of
Yeah.
displacement,
Mhm.
radical
Mhm.
displacement. And um, I think that I mean, I won't say that that's written into the language, but the language grew out of this landscape
Mhm.
of displacement. It's not a national language in the traditional sense that it's tied to one specific territory. It's uh it's a portable culture. It's
Mm.
decentralized, and that is yeah, on a structural level there is something radically um progressive
So
about
interesting.
that, I think. There's something radically useful and usefully radical about that. And I think as I was first getting into the language, I was looking for a that model of a decentralized cultural identity, an anti-nationalist identity, which isn't to say there isn't nationalism that can be expressed in Yiddish. That
Mhm.
happens all the time. But I think that if I were looking for ways to reject nationalism, reject chauvinism, reject um, sort of the hard borders
Yes.
between cultures and between identities, then Yiddish offered a very, very fruitful and inspiring template for
That
that
was
engagement, and it sounds theoretical, but the fact is it's reflected in the community which works in this language. That's the main thing that turned me on about this, in addition to the flavor of Yiddish and the actual music and the actual songs and the actual the tone of it, was the community, which is so diverse, so
Mhm.
international. um and not I won't even say that, yeah, it's probably overwhelmingly progressive politically, but there are also all kinds of folks in this community who are maybe
Mhm.
not so left wing. And for me, it was like, oh, okay, this is a Jewish cultural space which is overwhelmingly more politically progressive than I was used to coming from Michigan. Um, and there's this kind of proxy cultural shared space that we can interact in with people who I maybe wouldn't have so much to do with, because maybe their politics
Mm.
don't jive with mine, or their attitude towards religion, or you know and so I value the diversity of that community. I value the ways in which generations are
Mm.
collaborative with each other, that there's not a lot, it's a there's a lot of permeable, it's very, very loose borders, permeable walls.
I'm reminded of two things, sir. I'm reminded of the almost cliched notion now. I don't know who said it first, that Yiddish would be a terrible language to wage a war in. That maybe other languages are better at warfare. I think there's something kind of intrinsically almost humorous or ironic about Yiddish parlance that would be make it a bad language for warfare. And the other thing I was thinking is that maybe Yiddish is the language of Doikite. Doikite being a historical Yiddish-based movement for here-ness. Doikite means here-ness.
Mhm.
The idea that Jews, rather than having some kind of nationalist vision, that Jews seek liberation wherever they are. Here, being here, as in here-ness.
It's amazing that Doikite is having this. It's not actually it's it's testament to the usefulness of this idea that Doikite is totally having this moment right now. And I'm meeting all kinds of people who have like hats that say Doikite. Someone spotted a license plate. I mean, okay, to use I came up with a clever little buzzword about Doikite, which is that, like, if Gullus is about
Yiddish for exile, right?
displacement,
Mhm.
then Doikite is about this placement.
Oh, very good.
You know that, like, there's positivity to it. As much as Doing Kite was a political reaction to Zionism, I love that it's not negative. It's not detractive. It's a purely positive um utterance or program. And that's
I always thought that Doikite has within it a kind of call to action,
Mhm.
that it's not just about living in a place, but it's about improving a place.
Yeah, it's about revolution. It's about socialism. It can't it's not it can't and it shouldn't be divorced from that. It's not simply um it's not assimilationism. It's
Mhm.
not about oh, no, we just want to belong here. It's about, we want to be a part of radically improving each place that we are, wherever we are, which for me is deeply, deeply Jewish in the best way, and that's something that I fully embrace.
So I want to get back to Yiddish and how it's such a big important part of
Mhm.
your artistic identity. You spend a fair amount of time negotiating the space between English and Yiddish through translation back and forth. For example, you had this enormous viral hit,
Mhm.
YouTube hit with Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah sung in Yiddish. I was pleased to hear your Yiddish version of the Velvet Underground's All Tomorrow's Parties.
Right on, yeah.
I was just, pleased as punch by that. And of course, you do the other thing too. You translate Yiddish songs into English. I'm thinking of your wonderful translations of songs like Arbeiter Freuen and In Kampf, these classic Yiddish songs. What compels you to create Yiddish versions of beloved English songs, and what happens to these songs when they enter the Yiddish universe? In other words, why do it?
Well, okay, those are great questions. To be perfectly honest, like the reason why is that it's really fun and
Okay.
it allows me to gain a kind of intimacy with songs that I already love and to find out things about those songs that I wouldn't have found out otherwise. You know, I and sometimes because people ask me to do it. Like the Hallelujah thing was not my idea. It was Frank London
Mhm.
who sent out a call to a couple of folks like, "Hey, we want to sing Hallelujah. Does anybody want to translate a verse or two into Yiddish for Klez Canada?" And I was like, I'll give it a crack." And my history with that song is, goes pretty far back to the 90s when I first heard it and became obsessed with it.
Mhm.
Um, I And yeah, I probably first heard the Jeff Buckley version before I had a copy of various positions. But
The Leonard Cohen record. Yes. Mhm.
yeah, the record it was originally on. And so, but when I sat down and started to puzzle it, um, it sort of just drew me in. And I was at the time I was at Yiddish Summer Weimar, the wonderful program uh, run by Alan Byrne and in Germany, and Michael Alpert was around and Mendy Kahn was around. And then later on, I was in New York and I showed it to Joshua Letsky. So I workshopped it with a lot of these mavens. And I just kept finding more and more in the original that I wouldn't have seen had I not created the Yiddish version of it. Um, and so, I'm a puzzler. I do the New York Times puzzle every day. Translating a song writing a song is also a bit like a puzzle, but translation is more of a puzzle because I like having the clues, which are the original. The original functions as a clue for the translation, which is the solution.
Um, does it matter? And I guess you've kind of already answered this because you translated Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land," who's not Jewish.
Along with some other folks. Yeah, that was Linda Gritz's.
Um, but does it matter if the songwriter is Jewish if you're going to translate the song into Yiddish? For example, Leonard Cohen and Lou Reed are both Jewish. Does it matter?
No, well, not anything. Not it. Look, there are things that just like when you start translating a song into any language, it's like you have to ask yourself, like, well, why does this need to be? What would it gain by being in a different language?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what
Um,
I'm asking. That's exactly it.
I don't know. I don't know if it like it may play a role that these songs were written by Jews insofar as there was Jewish content in them
Mhm.
already.
Mhm.
Obviously Hallelujah is full of all these like Old Testament references. Um, but I'm gonna putting it into Yiddish, I'm probably gonna make it more Jewish. You're gonna make it more Jewish no matter
Absolutely.
who wrote it. Like, yes, Lou Reed was Louis Allen Rabinowitz is, his
Ugh,
full name.
I
And
didn't
like,
know that. That's great.
yeah, yeah. Like, it's like I don't know if there's anything inherently Jewish about all tomorrow's parties.
All right, let's move on. Tell me about winning the Dreaming in Yiddish prize, and also about your relationship with the beloved Adrienne Cooper, who was one of my favorite people in the world.
Amen. Adrienne Cooper, Ollie Sholem. Like I remember when I first laid ears on her and
Mhm.
eyes, and it was at Klez Canada. I remember the first time I heard her sing Voltich Gehat Koyach,
Mhm.
the Sholem song. I remember, like, I had the honor and privilege of getting to know Adrienne in so many different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
I had her as a teacher. I had her as the mother of one of my best friends, Sarah Gordon. I had her as a colleague, and I got to know her in Canada. I got to know her in New York. I got to watch her and Marilyn do master classes in Moscow. For several years, I would be at the Yiddish Fest in Moscow, or on the outskirts of Moscow, and to watch and be part of that was an education in and of itself, about teaching and about singing and about being an artist.
Mm-hmm.
She was such a Renaissance woman. She was such a polymath, and she had such an incredible sense of humor. Um, I learned so much about how to embody research, how to be the thing that there was nothing like kind of like there was nothing academic about what she did, but it was deeply, deeply researched. She was like, I don't know, she em- she embodied the song. And so she embodied not only the cultural content, but she was able to project the context around herself. She created context.
Mm-hmm.
And she was a part of, and her work as a researcher and a teacher and an organizer, her work with at the Workers' Circle, her work earlier with YIVO. Um, and I know people in so many different countries. I know people in Germany, people in Israel, people in Russia, in Latvia, in Ukraine, in South America, in certainly North America, who just owe so much to her
Mm-hmm.
um as a person, and an artist.
Mm-hmm.
At the ceremony for the Dreaming in Yiddish thing, I talked about something that she had taught me about Szymanski, which was that he embodied the Bundist ideal, which is that one would be um, an artist, a scientist, and a revolutionary. And which he was all three. He was an ethnographer, and a journalist. He was a poet and a playwright, and he was a revolutionary, um, and an activist. And so that I can't think of anyone who embodies those three things better than Adrienne did,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
within our world, certainly. And when she passed, it was like such a trauma. It was a trauma for the whole community because not, yeah, because of who she was and because of her influential, you know, her effect on the entire community. And that she was the bridge generation. She wasn't one of the older generation. She died with so much left to do.
Yes, that's an excellent point. Her work was not done. She still had so much to offer, and it's a grave loss. If I may change the subject, um, there's lots to cover here. Very briefly, why Germany? When did you first go there, and why did you decide to stay?
Well, to talk about that one has to talk about Brave Old World, because Alan Byrne offered me his apartment and to sublet in 2005, and I wanted to get the hell out of the States. I wanted to get over to Europe. I wanted to like learn about Yiddish and Klezmer, and and German, and I was really into German theater stuff at the time, and I wanted to live over here. And I subletted Alan's apartment, and with that came all of his incredible books. Alan,
Alan Byrne,
yeah,
accordionist for Brave Old World, major band.
yeah, it's this amazing group with Michael Alpert and Kurt Björling and Stuart Brotman, and coming over to Berlin Alan became a major mentor for me and a good friend. And I read all of his books and I listened to all of his CDs and I played all of his accordions and I lived in his place for a couple of years. He wasn't there. He was getting a PhD. I would see him at festivals.
Mhm.
And that's when I got to know Michael Alpert as a teacher and a singer. And he really, in terms of my education about Yiddish folk song culture and the language, and I mean, he's been an incredibly important mentor and friend for me. And Michael wasn't in Berlin so much, but getting to know Alan, folks like Paul Brody, and then the younger generation of folks who were coming to Berlin more and more. And now all of them are in Berlin, and I live here in Hamburg. But I got to know Ilyas Schneeves. I got to know um, Sasha Luria. I got to know Sveta Kundish, who eventually moved to Berlin.
What is it about Berlin?
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking. Why? Why?
Well, my friend Jake Schneider, he recently gave a talk about Yiddishkeit in Berlin, and he said, talking about Yiddish as a decentralized culture, he said, just as a bagel, were it to have a center, would cease to be a bagel, Yiddish, were it to have a center, would cease to be Yiddish. And so, it's not that Berlin is a center for Yiddish, but it's one of several. Berlin is a kind of theoretical meeting ground for some of the worst and best ideas of history.
Gotcha. Yeah.
It's where sort of Hamburg's different. I've been here for 3 years, and Hamburg is a mercantile city. It's a Hanseatic port city. We're here in a former industrial harbor. It's all about raw materials and capital.
Mhm.
And there's a deep working class history in Hamburg, and I dig Hamburg. It's a workers' city. I like that, but it's also a city of incredible bourgeois bullshit.
Mhm.
Berlin is not that. It was never that. It was never about capital in Berlin. It was never about industry in Berlin. Berlin has always been a poor city until very recently. And it's always been about theoretical space and abstractions. It's a city for politics. It's a city for art and culture. And it's an incredibly cosmopolitan city, a very international city. Um, Working at the Gorky Theater there, I've never worked around intimately with people from a more diverse background who bring so many different cultures to bear in establishing, common ground, creative common ground.
Mhm.
And in that environment, making Yiddishkeit a modern, progressive medium for creation was a very organic thing. There were a bunch of us who were all living around there. We were all in this community. We were all, I have friends now, they meet every week at a bar and they only speak Yiddish with each other, and they write poetry and they have events and they do radical Yiddish walking tours and it's a really exciting place. I'm in Berlin several times a month. I mean, like,
Mhm.
I commute a lot. Um,
How far is that commute? Just out of curiosity.
this is 2 hours by train.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Um.
But I mean, like, I don't know. I've been in Germany for almost 20 years. There are some absurdities and ridiculous uh, things that one has to deal with. There are things that I can't stand about it, but there are things that I really appreciate about it here. And it's changed a lot. It's changing now. Um, but I still appreciate it.
So this kind of relates. I think I'd like to talk to you about the elephant in
Mhm.
the room.
Yeah.
We
No, don't be.
when Jews get together, we need to talk about the elephant in the room. The last 7 months have been absolutely heart wrenching, of course, for Palestinians, for everyone with a conscience, for Jews, of course.
Mhm.
And, I'm just going to lay my cards on the table, as it were. I consider what's going on in Gaza a genocide. I'm not going to speak for my entire organization or anything, but I would characterize myself as an anti-Zionist. And I'm going to make certain assumptions about you based on your political proclivities. I don't want to assume things, but I'm going to do that.
You can go ahead and make assumptions.
Yeah. So where do we stand? What's it like for you right now? And how do you express your Jewishness during these times?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to get into the terminology and like what I count myself as or what certain,
Again,
you know,
I was just laying my cards on the
no,
table.
no, that's fine. That's fine. And I'm not going to contradict you in any regard. And you have my full solidarity and support. I, uh, I think that there's a lot, just as a caveat before I like say anything generally. I think that right now we're getting so hung up on really divisive language,
Yes.
and there's all this jargon and all these sort of shibboleths for like the teams. And I feel like a lot of that takes a lot of bandwidth and it takes a lot of focus away from what's actually happening and like people who are, I know a lot of folks who've lost work. I've lost some work here and there, like there are lines being drawn. The the Jewish Cold War or the Cold War among Jews, as my friend Eric Drucker once put it, has gotten less cold. Um, but I want to not lose sight of like I don't want the discourse to overtake the discourse.
Yes. Yes.
Um, like yeah, like whole towns are being wiped out, families are being wiped out. Um, we're caught in a cycle of like radical disassociation,
Hmm.
dehumanization,
Hmm.
um, the erasure of subjectivities, the like people being literally incapable of holding empathy for other human beings in the name of feeling unempathized with.
Yeah. Fear
Everyone is so
in a state of fear.
trapped in their own fear, trapped in their own pain.
Hmm.
And this is not to discount anyone's pain.
Hmm.
We were not offered the opportunity to have any kind of real mourning, any kind of real processing of trauma, of the horrible things that happened on October 7th.
Yes.
That was an absolute obscenity. It was an atrocity.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and I don't think that it is in any regard a negation of that, of recognizing that to call for an immediate ceasefire and an immediate end to this senseless, destructive, murderous war, which has no chance of achieving any of the aims which it supposedly was supposed to.
So we agree.
Yeah, we agree. I think we agree on that. But so I'm
What I'm getting at,
yeah.
is that all that you just said sounds so reasonable and logical and compassionate,
Mhm.
and sort of commonsensical, and yet saying something like that gets such a terrible reaction from so many people in my community.
I know that.
All sorts of hatred, and perhaps what defines my community is a question unto itself. But so, do you get the same kind of thing from the Jewish community in Germany?
Sure. Not only among Jews. I mean, the mainstream discourse here has been incredibly repressive and McCarthyistic. There's a kind of McCarthyism to the ways in which language is being policed, and to the ways in which, I mean, yeah, like yes, it clamps down pretty hard on progressive Jewish voices and leads to sort of certain absurdities like people being told that they're not allowed to protest with banners or slogans or songs in Hebrew or Yiddish because the German police don't have the ability to translate those things to make sure that nothing anti-Semitic is being said. It's Kafkaesque. Yeah. But I'll say this though, and this takes us back to what we were talking about earlier with Doe Kite. And I'm thinking about this also in terms of, I'm about to make a record next month with Jake Schulman and Christian David, my dear friend and collaborator. And a lot of these songs that are on there, they deal with displacement, with identity, with restlessness. Basically, what I love about the idea of Doe Kite is its positivity, its formal positivity, that it's constructive rather than rather than say I'm anti this or anti that. It has to do with building and nurturing a model of Jewish culture, which is something to actually build on, and which is built on solidarity. And I don't know if like this word is like intersectionality, if we even still say that, but it's
Allowed, yes.
It has to do with solidarity, though. It has to do with human solidarity. I embrace that, and that inspires me to have a positive model of cultural belonging and creativity. So that's something that I'm thinking about in this context. And the Palestinian friends that I've been working with, and just trying to reach out to and be in touch with, like, they get it.
Yeah.
They get that. It's there's a lot of really hard thinking that's going on right now about what liberation actually means and what support actually means. And granted, it's not hard to find a lack of thoughtfulness on any side of these situations right now, and not only the situation in Israel and Palestine, but the situations, the ongoing situation in Ukraine and in Russia. There are horrible rifts in the so-called left here, where you're finding a lot of apologists for Putin that really make me sick. When I think that, like, how much moral clarity do you need then in these two situations, and also to see that we don't need to be relativizing aggression or militarism or war. Like, it's not necessary in the name of pain or in the name of expedience.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin and our guest, Daniel Kahn. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name is David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.